My family claimed I moved away, forever. The will said otherwise, so I would like to tell you my life real story. My name is Martin Hale, and I am 56 years old, and my life has taught me that betrayal does not always come from strangers. Many times it grows quietly inside the very house where you once felt safe. I was born in a small American town where neighbors liked to act friendly and polite on the surface, yet beneath that surface people carried stories that could shake the ground right under your feet. Folks often say that as you get older you begin to understand people better. They say time clears the fog and helps you see things more honestly. But in my case, time did not bring clarity. It brought a sharper and deeper truth that cut through every memory I ever held close. I spent most of my life believing my family stood on my side. Yet I learned the hard way that sometimes the people who share your blood can still turn you into a stranger without ever saying a word to your face. I never imagined that one day I would walk through my hometown and hear whispers behind me telling an entirely different story about my life. A story that claimed I had packed my bags and moved away forever. A story that said I walked out without a warning and never looked back. Folks told my neighbors that I cut ties with my father, that I turned my back on the house where I was raised, that I drifted off and built a new life far from the people who once knew me. The strange thing is I never did any of that. I lived only an hour away. I visited whenever they called for help. I drove late nights just to fix a broken pipe or repair a loose hinge or lift a heavy box. And yet the version of me that my own family shared with the world was a man who had left them behind. A man who forgot where he came from. A man who did not care anymore. Hearing people repeat those false stories felt like someone slowly peeling away the life I had lived and replacing it with a lie I never agreed to. I can still remember the first time I felt something was off. It was an early winter morning with a cold wind blowing across the yard. I came home for a short visit, and the moment I stepped inside, I sensed something strange. You know that quiet tug in your gut when something is wrong, but you cannot point exactly at it. That was how I felt. My brother and sister kept glancing at each other, as if they shared a secret I was not supposed to hear. Their voices softened when I walked past. Their smiles were stiff, like they were afraid something might slip out. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe I was imagining things, or maybe I was tired from the long drive. But every time they whispered, and then went silent as I entered the room, that little warning voice in my head grew louder. Looking back, I realize now that my family had been preparing a world without me long before I even sensed it. They spoke to neighbors. They told stories. They built this version of my life where I simply faded away. They thought if they repeated it enough times it would become real. They thought they could erase me by telling others that I was gone for good. They spoke the lie so often they convinced themselves it was the truth. And the saddest part is that I did not even know any of it was happening. I kept visiting. I kept calling. I kept trying to be the good son and the responsible older brother. I held on to the belief that family stands together even if life gets messy or hard. But while I stood by them, they were busy painting me out of the picture entirely. The turning point came much later, but when it came, it hit me with the force of a storm tearing through an old house. Everything changed the moment my father passed away. I returned home expecting grief and silence and memories. Instead, I found people looking at me as if I was some long-lost man returning from a far corner of the world. Some were shocked to see me standing there. Others whispered in confusion. A few even asked if I had secretly come back to town after many years away. I did not understand any of this at first. My heart was too heavy with the loss of my father. But then a neighbor pulled me aside with a puzzled expression and asked when I had decided to return after leaving forever. That was the moment my stomach dropped. That was the moment the fog lifted and the betrayal finally showed its face. I learned that my siblings had been telling everyone that I left them behind, that I had cut myself away from the family, that I refused to come home even when they needed me. They told that story again and again until people believed it without question. The hurt of hearing that truth is something I still struggle to describe. It felt like someone reached into my chest and twisted everything I ever trusted. It felt like my own flesh and blood had quietly written me out of the last years of my father's life, and I had no chance to defend myself because I did not even know they were doing it. But the biggest shock of all waited inside my father's final will, a will that held truths none of us were ready for, a will that exposed everything my siblings tried to bury, a will that made it clear that I had never left, that I had been loyal and present, that my father had seen through every lie they told. And in that moment the story they built for years collapsed under the weight of my father's words. That is why I want to tell this story from the beginning, because betrayal does not always look loud or violent. Sometimes it hides behind friendly smiles. Sometimes it grows in silence. Sometimes it comes from people who share your own name. And yet the truth, even when buried, still finds a way to rise. My story is not just about hurt. It is about justice slowly pushing through the cracks of deception. It is about one man discovering that the will of a father can speak louder than every lie spoken behind his back. And as I take you through this journey step by step, I hope you feel the rawness of each moment, the shock, the pain, the quiet anger, and eventually the rise of truth that refused to die. I grew up as the oldest of 3 children, and that role shaped nearly every part of my life from the day I first understood what responsibility meant. My younger brother Luke arrived 3 years after me, and my sister Tanya came 2 years after him. They were close from the start in a way that sometimes made me feel like an outsider in my own home. They shared jokes and secrets and plans, while I spent more time by my father's side learning the ways of the workshop. My father believed in early mornings and steady hands, and he often said that a man should be known for his work more than for his words. I wanted to make him proud, so I followed his lead even on the days when I wanted to run outside and join other kids. Looking back now, I can see how those long hours slowly shaped the path I walked for the next several decades. My father never said that I was his favorite child, but he often said things like, "You understand responsibility better than your brother and sister," or "I can rely on you in ways I cannot rely on them." At the time, I thought these were words of trust and respect. I thought he was grooming me to take on bigger things. But as I grew older, I began to see another truth hiding beneath those compliments. He gave me more work not because he trusted me, but because I never refused. Luke and Tanya found ways to slip away from chores. They said they had schoolwork or social plans or sudden headaches. My father would sigh and shake his head, and then turn to me with the same old line that I was the reliable one. And I carried the weight every time because that was what was expected of me. My mother was the only one who saw how hard I was pushing myself, though she rarely interfered with my father's way of teaching. She would sit me down at night and tell me that being the oldest meant being patient. She said Luke and Tanya would find their way eventually, and that I should not resent them for taking their time to grow up. She had a gentle heart, and she meant well, but her words planted something inside me that lasted for years. I came to believe that every burden placed on me was simply part of my duty as the oldest child. I thought that if I complained, I would look selfish. So I stayed quiet and strong and available for everyone except myself. As we got older, the gap between us only grew. Luke chased every new hobby that flashed across his mind. One year he wanted to become a musician. The next year he wanted to build cars. The year after that he said he was meant for the outdoors and talked endlessly about moving to the mountains. He never stuck with anything long enough to make it work. Tanya spent most of her teenage years out with friends. She always seemed to be dressed up and running somewhere. She liked being noticed. She liked being admired. She liked the idea of life happening somewhere beyond the small town we lived in. She took every chance to escape responsibility, while I stayed behind to finish the work she left undone. There were moments when I tried to join them. I tried to be part of their small world, but each time I arrived I felt like a visitor. They laughed at their own stories. They talked about people I barely knew. They made plans that never included me. Slowly I learned to stay in my own space. My world revolved around the workshop where the scent of sawdust and metal became as familiar to me as the air I breathed. My father trusted me to handle repairs that other men twice my age still struggled with. Customers respected me, but none of that filled the emptiness I felt inside the house. It was as if I existed for my usefulness and not for my presence. When I reached 29, the desire for something of my own finally pushed me to make a choice. I found a job in a nearby city. It was not far from home, only about an hour away if you took the long road. I thought the change would help me grow. I was proud of myself for taking that step. I had spent so many years living under the weight of others that having my own space felt like I had finally exhaled after holding my breath since childhood. Yet even after moving, I stayed closely tied to my family. Every time the phone rang and I heard my mother's tired voice or my father's firm tone, I packed my things and drove down to help. Whenever Luke or Tanya had something break or needed to move furniture or wanted money for some new plan, they called me first. And each time I said yes, even if I was exhausted or overwhelmed. At the time, I believed these choices made me a good son and a good brother. I believed this was what a loyal man was supposed to do. My mother always said that family stands together, and I wanted to honor her words. But the truth was that, while I kept holding on to them, they were slipping further away from me. They began making decisions without me. They planned events without inviting me. They spoke with neighbors and told stories about how busy they were with each other and how little they heard from me. But they never told anyone that I was the one who rescued them every time the smallest problem came up. They never mentioned how often I showed up late at night to fix a broken pipe or repair a fallen shelf. They acted as if those things never happened. I remember one summer afternoon when I returned home for a visit. I had brought tools and parts because my father said something in the workshop needed attention. When I walked in, Luke looked at me as if he was surprised to see me. He told me I had been gone too long even though I had visited just a few weeks earlier. Tanya glanced up from her phone and asked what brought me back this time, as if my presence needed an explanation. Moments like that slowly built into a pattern. A pattern where I felt like an outsider in the very place I grew up. A pattern where everything I did was forgotten while every rumor they spread quietly strengthened. Looking back now, I realize I was being pushed out long before I understood it. Not pushed out loudly, but pushed out in small, silent ways. They built a world where I was only useful when they needed something. A world where I had a purpose only when there was a chore to finish. They treated my moving to the city as if I had abandoned them, even though I came home more often than many people who lived in the same state as their families. They used my distance as a story tool. Something they could twist into a tale that suited their needs. And while I was trying to build an honest life, they were slowly reshaping the truth to fit their own comfort. At the time, I thought everything was fine. I thought the distance I felt was normal. I thought families changed as they grew older. I never imagined they were laying the groundwork for a story that would one day be used to erase me completely. But the truth is that betrayal does not always come in one loud moment. Sometimes it comes in quiet shifts. Sometimes it comes from the slow fading of voices that once called your name. Sometimes it grows while you are busy trying to be helpful. And by the time you realize what is happening, the story has already been written without you. Years passed quietly, and in those quiet years I convinced myself that everything was fine. I thought routine meant stability. I thought silence meant peace. I worked my job, paid my bills, and treated my family obligations almost like a second full-time responsibility. Every major holiday, I was the first one through the door. Every time an appliance broke, I drove 2 hours back home to fix it. Every time Luke got himself into a mess or Tanya needed money for something she claimed was urgent, I stepped in without hesitation. I never asked questions. I never asked for anything in return. I thought that was loyalty. I thought that was love. But in reality, I was feeding a dynamic that allowed them to act as if my time and my life existed purely for their convenience. Then one winter changed everything. The air that year felt heavier than usual. like the season had something to say and was waiting for the right moment. When I walked into Dad's house, I smelled old wood, dust, and the faint trace of the motor oil he always carried on his hands, as if it clung to him like a second skin. He was sitting in his armchair, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the window like he was searching for something far beyond the snow. When he turned toward me, his smile was real, but there was a tiredness in his eyes I had not seen before. He cleared his throat and told me he needed to update his will. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People get older, people prepare. It was normal, but the way he gripped the side of his chair when he said it made something tug at the back of my mind. He asked me to stay for a few days. He said he wanted to talk about some things before meeting the lawyer. His voice held a weight behind it, like he had been carrying a stone for too long and finally needed help setting it down. I stayed because I trusted him, but while I stayed, I saw something I was not meant to see. Luke and Tanya were acting off, not simply distant I was used to. No, this was something sharper, something uncomfortable. They whispered in corners, paused mid-sentence when I walked in, exchanged glances that looked more like warnings than expressions. Whenever I asked what they were talking about, they'd smile with that brittle, artificial smile that feels like it might shatter if you look at it too long. They'd claim it was nothing, but it was the kind of nothing that fills a room with tension. One evening, while Dad was asleep, I walked into the kitchen to get some water. The moment I stepped in, Tanya and Luke froze like two kids caught doing something they shouldn't. Luke's hand slipped away from the drawer he'd been searching through, and Tanya stood straighter, her cheeks flushing like guilt had crawled up her neck. I asked them if something was wrong. They both said no too quickly. It was the kind of no that didn't answer a question, it dodged it. That night, long after they thought I had gone to bed, I heard them again. The hallway was dark, the house settling with the small groans old homes make. I stood near the wall, half hidden, listening as their voices floated from the kitchen, low, tense, panicked. I couldn't catch every word, but I didn't need to, because then Tanya said the sentence that cracked the ground under my feet. "You know, we already told everyone that he left for good." My heart hammered so loud I thought they'd hear it from the other room. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe right. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who left for good? Why did it sound like they were talking about me? My name wasn't spoken aloud, but the weight of the words landed squarely on my chest. It felt like hearing your own eulogy while your pulse is still beating. Luke muttered something back, too low for me to catch, but his tone wasn't angry, it was scared. And Tanya's breathing was shallow, like she knew they had crossed a line they could never uncross. I stepped back quietly, my hands suddenly cold. I didn't want to hear more. I wasn't sure I could handle hearing more. The next morning, over the stiffest breakfast I can remember, I asked them again if something was going on. Their faces were bright with practiced friendliness, their voices too smooth, too cheerful. They talked like actors reading lines from a script they had rehearsed 100 times. They insisted nothing was wrong. They acted insulted that I even asked. But something had shifted inside me. A quiet, unsettling certainty. The sense that the ground beneath me had been slowly tilting for years, and I was only now noticing that everything around me had been rearranged without my permission. The truth was out there, circling me like a shadow waiting for its moment. And deep down, I knew one terrible thing. Whatever my siblings were hiding, whatever they had told others, whatever lie they had built, it involved me. And it was bigger than anything I had ever feared. Dad passed away a month later, and when I say that something inside me broke, I mean it in the truest, rawest way a human heart can fracture. It wasn't just grief. It was something heavier, like a storm that settles deep in your ribcage and refuses to leave. He had been the anchor of our home, the one piece of us that held some shape of unity, even if it was fragile. When that anchor vanished, the whole structure of my world tilted in a way I wasn't prepared for. I drove home at dawn. The sky was still pale, touched with that cold blue that comes just before sunrise. The road felt longer than usual, emptier, as if the world itself knew a chapter of my life had closed. But the moment I stepped out of the car, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. It was a coldness that came from people, their eyes, their silence, their startled reactions. A coldness that said something had been rewritten in my absence. As I walked toward the house, people gathered outside turned to look at me. Really look at me. Not like someone returning home after loss, but like someone they hadn't seen in years. Someone they thought was gone. Their faces held confusion, shock, and a strange curiosity that made my skin crawl. A couple of neighbors frowned and whispered. Others nudged each other and stared as if I were a ghost walking back into a place that no longer recognized me. Then an old neighbor approached Mrs. Carter, who used to bring us cookies when we were kids. She squinted at me as if trying to connect two broken ends of a memory and said, "Martin, when did you come back from that faraway state you moved to? Luke told us you started a new life and cut ties with everyone." Her words hit me like a fist straight to the chest. A faraway state, moved away, cut ties. I stood there stunned, confused, hurt in ways I didn't yet understand. I didn't move away. I lived just over an hour from home. I visited often. I called. I helped. I showed up every single time they needed me. So why would anyone believe I had left forever? Before I could make sense of anything, a family friend pulled me aside, his expression twisted with discomfort. He lowered his voice as if he were revealing something forbidden. He told me he thought I had abandoned my family, that Luke and Tanya told everyone I had walked away from them years ago, that I had chosen a selfish life, that I didn't care enough to visit Dad. He said he'd always felt bad for Dad being left behind by his eldest son. My ears rang, my vision blurred. For a moment I couldn't feel the ground beneath my feet. My own siblings had erased me. Not just from their lives, from the whole community. They turned me into a stranger. A traitor. A disappointment. They lied to every person who knew me. They told folks they didn't know where I lived anymore. They claimed I refused to answer their calls. They said I hadn't visited Dad because I simply didn't want to. They even said, with straight faces, that I had changed my number just to avoid them. They made it sound like Dad spent his last years wondering why I disappeared, why his eldest son abandoned him. They made the world believe that I chose to leave my father alone in his old age. Hearing that shattered something inside me so violently I almost couldn't stand still. My throat tightened until breathing became a chore. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to scream that it was all lies, that I had been there all along, that I had done everything they asked and more. But all that came out was silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. I felt like a ghost walking among people who had been given a false story about my life. A story crafted by the two people who should have stood beside me, not against me. And the worst part, Dad had passed away believing some of those lies, or at least hearing them whispered around him. I didn't know to what extent he believed them, but just the thought that he might have spent even a single moment wondering why I wasn't there, when I had always been there, tore into me like a blade. Yet even with all of that crashing down on me, with betrayal settling into my bones like ice, I didn't know the worst was still waiting. Because the final blow, the betrayal so deep it would change everything, was hidden inside a sealed envelope in a lawyer's office. And once that envelope was opened, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. The day of the will reading felt unreal, as if I were walking through a fog that refused to lift. The house smelled like old wood and memories, and every step I took carried the weight of decades. I sat at the long oak table in the lawyer's office, the same table where townsfolk had signed deeds and settled estates for generations. It was quiet in the room except for the soft ticking of a wall clock, each second echoing like a reminder that time had moved on without waiting for any of us to catch up. I expected something simple. Dad was never a man of luxury. His whole life fit into a few worn-out drawers and some dusty shelves. The biggest things he owned were the workshop, the house, and a small savings account he built penny by penny over the years. I thought we would divide everything equally. That was what families did, or so I still believed back then. Luke sat across from me with a smug calmness, leaning back like a man waiting to receive what he thought he deserved. Tanya lounged in her chair with her arms folded, tapping her nail against her sleeve as if she were impatient for the formality to end. They acted like they were confident, like they already knew how the story would unfold. I kept my hands folded and waited, trying to steady the uncomfortable twist in my stomach. Something about the way they sat there felt wrong. Too sure, too rehearsed, as if they had built a whole future in their heads without even considering that I was part of this family too. Or maybe they had already removed me from it in their minds long ago. When the lawyer cleared his throat and opened the folder, the air in the room shifted, sharp and heavy. He looked at us one by one, pausing for a moment before reading aloud. His voice started steady, but as he spoke the first few lines, I noticed a flicker in his expression. A slight lift of his eyebrows, a small breath drawn in. A quiet signal that what he was reading was not what Luke and Tanya had expected. Dad had written a new will. Not an update. Not a small change. A completely rewritten document that none of us had seen. And the moment the lawyer spoke the first sentence naming me the executor, Luke's smug expression vanished as if someone had pulled the mask off his face. Tanya stopped tapping. Her arms slowly dropped to her sides. Her chin stiffened like she'd swallowed something sharp. Dad had written about me, about my loyalty, about my years of stepping up for him. He mentioned each sacrifice I had made, things I barely remembered doing because helping him felt natural to me. He wrote that I had always been there, that I showed up without being asked, that I stood by him even when life turned difficult and responsibilities piled up. The lawyer continued reading, and each line felt like a beam of truth cutting through years of shadows. Dad wrote that he was fully aware of the lies spread around town about me. Lies about me abandoning the family. Lies about me turning my back on him. Lies that painted me as a son who drifted away on purpose. He spelled it out clearly in words that could not be twisted. He wrote that I never left, that I never abandoned him, that he knew exactly who had started the rumors. Luke's jaw tightened. Tanya's breathing grew shallow. Their confident little world cracked right there at that table, breaking quietly like thin glass under slow pressure. Then came the part I never expected. Dad left the workshop to me, not shared, not conditional. He handed it directly to me because he said I was the only one who honored the craft. He said I respected the space because I understood what it meant to him. Then he instructed that the house be sold with the profit divided evenly among the three of us. It was fair, balanced, thoughtful, nothing cruel, nothing spiteful, just honest. But the part that struck my soul was the letter. The lawyer handed it to me carefully, like it carried something fragile. My name was written in Dad's uneven handwriting, the same handwriting that used to mark my school lunch bags with small notes. I held the letter for a moment before opening it, my fingertips trembling. When I finally unfolded it, Dad's voice seemed to come alive through the ink. He explained everything. Everything I had feared. Everything that I tried to believe wasn't true. He wrote that he had overheard my siblings whispering many times, telling others that I had moved away for good. He wrote that they tried to convince him to rewrite the will to remove me. They told him I was unreliable, that I had changed, that I no longer cared about him. Dad said he pretended to listen, but inside he knew the truth. He said he had seen me show up time and time again, with tired eyes but a willing heart. He said I carried the weight of the family long before anyone else realized it. And then he said something that made my chest ache so deeply I had to steady my breath. He said he made the new will not out of anger but out of clarity, that he wanted justice, quiet justice, written in the most permanent way he knew. He said he wanted me to know that he saw everything, that he understood me better than I ever thought, that I was never invisible to him. As I read his words, my hands trembled so hard I had to set the letter down on the table. My eyes blurred and I blinked quickly because I refused to cry in front of Luke and Tanya. A storm of emotion swelled in my chest, love for my father, grief for the years lost, rage at the lies, relief that the truth had finally found its way out. My father had seen the truth long before I did. He saw who I was, and he saw what my siblings had become. Luke stared at the table without speaking. Tanya looked like she was about to faint. Their confidence had evaporated, and now they wore the faces of people realizing that their game was exposed, their plan cracked open, their lies slipping out into the light where the whole room could finally see them for what they were. But even then, even in that moment of truth, I didn't know the storm that was coming next. Because when people who build their lives on lies suddenly feel their control slipping away, they don't surrender quietly. And Luke and Tanya were far from quiet. When the will finished being read, the air in that room felt thick and heavy like wet sand pressing against all of our chests. It felt hard to breathe, as if the truth itself had weight, and that weight had finally dropped right in front of us. Luke kept his eyes glued to the floor. His shoulders slumped, and he would not look at me at all. Tanya stared straight ahead at the blank wall like she hoped she could disappear inside it if she stared long enough. The lawyer kept his steady voice going while I sat there trying to calm the storm growing inside me. For most of my life I had tried to be patient and forgiving. I tried to believe the best in people, especially in family. But in that moment, something new rose inside me. It was not wild anger, and it was not revenge at first. It was a sharp, clear understanding that the two people I trusted the most had created a false version of me. A version that never existed. They erased my presence, turned my loyalty into nothing, and wrote my life out of the story of our family. And now, the truth, my father's truth, stood right there in the open with no place for them to hide. When the lawyer closed the file, he asked if anyone had questions. His voice was calm, but even he could feel the tension filling the room. Luke shook his head without lifting his eyes. Tanya did not say a word. She did not move. I did not say anything either. I pushed myself up from the chair and walked outside because the walls felt too tight and my chest felt too full. I stepped into the cold winter air and let the sky settle my thoughts. The clouds hung low and gray. The wind brushed against my face, carrying the smell of frost and old wood and distant pine. I stood there thinking about Dad, thinking about every long drive I took home when they said they needed me. Thinking about the nights I fixed leaks or repaired broken locks while my siblings sat comfortably and called me dependable like it was a compliment at the time. Thinking about all the times I placed them first. Thinking about how all that time they were telling the town that I had vanished. That I had abandoned everyone. That truth hurt deeper than anything I had ever felt. It cut through years of effort and years of loyalty with one sharp slice. It made me feel hollow and yet strangely awake. But underneath that pain, I felt something else slowly forming. A steady sense that Dad had given me one final gift. A shield made of truth. A message written in his own hand showing the world he knew who I was. Showing that he never doubted me even when others spread lies. That realization settled into my chest and made me stand a little straighter in the cold air. Later that day, I walked into town for a moment of quiet. People saw me and approached slowly with careful steps like they were unsure if they should speak or stay silent. Some apologized right away because they now understood that the stories they heard were nothing but lies. Their eyes showed regret. They said they felt fooled and misled. Some said they wondered why Luke and Tanya had told them such things in the first place. I did not have answers for them because I barely had answers for myself. I had spent so many years believing loyalty would be returned, that kindness would be remembered. I simply told them the truth, that I had never left, that I lived close by, that I visited often, that I showed up whenever my father called. Their reactions softened some of the ache inside me, but the betrayal stayed heavy like a stone pressed against my heart. When I returned to the house, Luke was gone and Tanya was sitting in the living room with her hands clasped together. She did not speak. She did not make eye contact. The silence in the room was thick, heavy, almost painful. It was the silence of people who had been caught in their own lies and did not know how to face the person they wronged. I walked past her without stopping because I knew words would not fix what had been broken. Not then. Maybe not ever. That night I barely slept. My father's letter replayed in my head again and again. His words echoed through me like a quiet reminder that the truth had survived even when the people closest to me tried to bury it. I lay awake wondering why my siblings went so far to push me out, why they decided that erasing me would benefit them, why they thought lies would hold. I did not find answers. I only found a stronger sense of who I had become. A man who had given everything, and finally learned that sometimes the people you love most will walk over you if you do not stand up. What I did not know was that the will reading was only the beginning. The real storm, the real clash, the real unraveling of everything they had built was still waiting for me right around the corner. That night, long after everyone had left and the shadows of the workshop stretched like long fingers across the walls, I found myself unable to sleep. The weight of the will, the letter, the truth my father had carried alone for so long, it all pressed against my chest. I felt a strange mixture of anger and grief twisting inside me. I kept thinking, why? Why did Luke and Tanya push so hard to cut me out? What made them so confident, so ready to erase me as if I had never existed? Their arrogance didn't feel like ordinary sibling selfishness anymore. There had to be something underneath it, something deeper, something they never expected me to uncover. So I went to the workshop, the one Dad had left me, the one they assumed would be theirs. The smell of metal, old wood, and engine oil still lingered in the air. It felt like he was there with me. The place held memories in every corner. And for the first time, I looked at the workshop not just as Dad's workplace, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. I started opening drawers, cabinet after cabinet, digging through years of receipts, handwritten notes, sketches of repairs he planned to do, letters he had kept, and invoices he had filed away neatly. Dad was a quiet man, but he documented everything. And in that silence, he left behind the answers I didn't know I needed. I thought I would find simple papers, old tax files, maybe customer lists. Instead, I found something else entirely. Hidden behind the bottom drawer, taped to the wooden back panel like he didn't want anyone stumbling upon it by accident, was a thick binder. A binder I had never seen before. I pulled it out. It was dusty, edges frayed, definitely old but well protected. When I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. Inside were pages and pages of Dad's handwriting. Notes, observations, concerns, and suddenly I understood this was not random paperwork. This was Dad's private record, his evidence, his truth. As I read, the story started revealing itself like a slow, uncoiling snake. Dad had documented conversations with Luke and Tanya. He had written the dates, the tone, even the exact sentences they used. One entry said they wanted him to meet a friend of theirs who could modernize the will paperwork. Another mentioned that they kept repeating how unreliable I was, how I had moved on and would never come back. But they didn't stop there. They kept insisting that Dad should finalize things now before something unexpected happened. They pushed and pushed, and Dad, being the calm, observant man he was, listened, but quietly took notes instead of signing anything. But then I found the part that made everything fall into place. It wasn't just about inheritance. It wasn't about the house. It wasn't even about family dynamics. It was the workshop itself. According to his notes, Dad had fully paid off every debt tied to it years ago, actually. He had renovated parts of it. He had invested in new tools, tools worth thousands. The property value had gone up because the town had recently approved plans for new construction nearby. The workshop wasn't just a nostalgic building. It was an asset, a prime piece of land, a potential gold mine. And Dad had kept all of this quiet, probably because he didn't care about selling it. It was his life's work, his pride. But Luke and Tanya must have known. Maybe they overheard something. Maybe they saw documents lying around. Maybe someone told them what that land would be worth in just a few years. And suddenly everything became clear. Their behavior wasn't accidental. Their distance wasn't random. Their coldness wasn't new. It was calculated. They didn't just want me out of the picture emotionally. They wanted me gone legally, officially, permanently. Because without me, the workshop would go to them. They could sell it in a heartbeat, split the cash, move on. In those pages, Dad wrote about how he began noticing their shifts, the way they spoke to him, the way they tried to manipulate him, the way they brought that so-called friend. He wrote that he felt disappointed, even heartbroken, but he also wrote something else, something that tightened my throat. He wrote that every time they tried to pressure him, he thought of me. He remembered who showed up, who stayed, who worked by his side when he was sick, who carried boxes with him, who drove him to appointments, who never asked for anything except a place in the family. He wrote that even though others might believe the rumors Luke and Tanya spread, he didn't, not for a moment. He wrote that he knew they were lying to protect their own interests, that greed had blinded them, and that the more they pushed, the more he realized he needed to secure what he had built in the hands of the only child who didn't look at him like a bank account. Reading those words shook something inside me. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. This wasn't just a fight over property. It was a slow, strategic removal of me from the family picture so they could take everything Dad had ever worked for. And they had nearly succeeded. They had convinced the town I was gone. They had convinced themselves Dad would eventually give in. They had acted like the will was already theirs. They behaved as if I never mattered. And yet, despite all of that, despite the secrecy and manipulation and greed, Dad saw through them. Quietly, patiently, in his own thoughtful way. He watched, he listened. And then he acted, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with truth, with his pen, with his final decision. And now, with this binder in my hands, I understood their motive completely. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't emotional. It was planned, intentional, greedy. And as I kept reading page after page, their actions felt less like childish jealousy and more like a cold attempt to erase me for profit. Not accidentally, not impulsively, but deliberately. For the first time since the will reading, I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't questioning myself. I wasn't wondering why they hated me so much. I understood everything. This wasn't about family. This was about money. This was about control. This was about eliminating the one person who stood between them, and instant wealth. And now that their hidden motive was out in the open, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Their betrayal wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. A long, quiet, calculated plan. And Dad had stopped it, just in time. In the days that followed, a strange calm settled inside me. It wasn't peace exactly, not yet, but it was the kind of stillness that comes after you finally understand the battlefield you're standing on. For so long I had tried to make sense of the way Luke and Tanya treated me, the lies they wove so carelessly, the confidence they carried as if they were the heroes and I was the outsider intruding on their story. But now, with Dad's will in my hands and his letter still etched in my heart, I understood that justice didn't need to be loud, violent, or dramatic. Justice didn't need screaming matches or courtroom showdowns. Justice only needed the truth, slow, steady, undeniable truth. I realized I didn't want revenge. I didn't want them ruined or punished. I didn't want to waste whatever life I had left trying to hurt the people who already spent years hurting me. No, what I wanted was clarity. Restoration. I wanted Dad's name cleaned. I wanted my own name cleared. I wanted the lies they built to collapse under their own weight. And so my plan for justice began, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with action. The first place I turned to was the workshop. That building had always been a symbol of Dad, steady, hardworking, honest. I walked into it the morning after I found the binder, and for a long moment I just stood there in the doorway, staring at the dust floating through the beams of sunlight. The place looked tired, abandoned, almost like it had been holding its breath while waiting for someone to care again. So I rolled up my sleeves and began. I swept every corner. I dusted shelves that hadn't been touched in years. I sorted nails and screws, polished metal surfaces, wiped down the old cabinets Dad built himself. I repaired the wooden bench where he used to sit when he was tired. I fixed the loose hinges on the door. I organized tools so neatly it felt like a tribute to him. Day after day I worked, dawn to dusk sometimes, and people saw me. Neighbors passing by slowed down their steps. Old customers who used to bring their tractors and bikes for repair stopped by to talk. Some even walked inside and said it felt like seeing the workshop alive again. They remembered the years I worked by Dad's side. They remembered the times I stayed late to help. Slowly, quietly, the town began to see what was always true, that I was not the one who disappeared, I was the one who stayed. But I didn't stop there. I knew the lies Luke and Tanya had spread wouldn't disappear overnight, and I didn't want to become like them, shouting stories to defend myself. Instead, I chose something more powerful, Dad's own words, his handwriting, his truth. I took his letter, the one he addressed only to me, and I visited a few people. Not everyone, just the ones whose opinions mattered. The ones who had looked at me with doubt or distance the last few years. I didn't go to them to expose Luke and Tanya. I didn't go with anger or bitterness. I went with quiet honesty. I let them read the letter at their own pace. I watched their expressions shift from confusion to understanding to regret. They saw the pain in Dad's words. They saw the betrayal he wrote about. And they saw, clearly and without room for doubt, that the story Luke and Tanya spread all this time was nothing but a fabrication, a performance, a selfish script they wrote to erase me. I didn't have to defend myself anymore. Dad had defended me himself with his final words. And just like that, the truth began to move through the town, not as gossip, but as clarity. People asked questions, people connected dots, people approached Luke and Tanya with the same calmness I had shown. They didn't yell at them, they simply asked why. Why they said I had abandoned Dad, why they insisted I was never around, why their words didn't match the facts. And that kind of exposure, the quiet, unshakable kind, cut deeper than any dramatic confrontation ever could. Because you can argue with a rumor, you can argue with hearsay, but you cannot argue with a dead man's handwriting. They felt the walls closing in, and for the first time in a long time, they realized they had lost control over the story they once manipulated so easily. Meanwhile, I did what Dad entrusted me to do. I fulfilled my duty as executor of the will. I attended every meeting with the lawyer. I gathered the documents for the house sale. I signed papers. I followed the legal procedure step by step with precision and transparency. I didn't cheat. I didn't hide anything. I didn't twist the process the way they once tried to twist Dad. And this meant Luke and Tanya had to show up too. They had to sit in the same room as me. They had to sign the documents according to the will they never expected to see. And each time they walked in, their faces spoke more loudly than any apology ever could. Shock at being exposed, frustration that their plan had failed. Shame, though not the kind that comes from guilt, but the kind that comes from being caught. And yet, even then, not one apology escaped their lips. They couldn't say the words, maybe because saying them would mean admitting the truth. Admitting they tried to erase me, manipulate Dad, and rewrite the reality of our family. Still, I wasn't seeking their apology, not anymore. My plan wasn't to break them, it wasn't to humiliate them, it wasn't to watch them fall apart. My plan was simple: restore what they had damaged, restore the dignity of my father's memory, restore the credibility of my own name. Restore the truth that had been twisted and buried under their lies, and strangely enough, reclaiming the workshop, showing up every day, rebuilding what they wanted to sell off for quick money. That became my quiet victory. Watching people realize the truth without me having to shout it, that became my justice. Letting the will stand as Dad intended it, that became the closure I didn't even know I needed. And as the days passed, as the house sale moved forward, as the town slowly recognized who I truly was and who my siblings truly were, I felt something in me begin to heal. Not completely, not perfectly, but slowly. And I realized that justice, real justice, doesn't always come wrapped in flames and destruction. Sometimes it arrives in silence. Sometimes it arrives in patience. Sometimes it arrives in the simple act of standing firm while the lies collapse on their own. And that was all I ever wanted, not revenge, not triumph over my siblings. I only wanted the truth to breathe again. I wanted my father's voice to be heard even after he was gone. And by honoring his words, by following the path he laid out for me, I found the justice he wanted me to have, not loud, not violent, but peaceful, steady, and undeniably earned.
Weeks passed after the house sale, and life began to settle into a rhythm that was both strange and comforting. The tension that had built up over years of silence and betrayal slowly eased, like a tide retreating after a storm. The profit from the sale had been divided exactly as Dad intended, under my careful supervision. I didn't rush to spend or invest it for selfish gain. Instead, I placed my share into something that mattered, not just to me, but to the town that had witnessed the story unfold. I poured every bit of it into repairing the workshop, transforming it from a place of old memories and dust into a small learning space where young folks could come and understand the basics of craftsmanship. I imagined them sanding wood, tightening bolts, hammering nails, learning not just skills but patience and pride in hard work. It was exactly the kind of thing Dad would have been proud of, and imagining his quiet nod from somewhere beyond made the ache in my chest soften just a little. Watching the first few kids arrive, seeing their eyes light up when they held a tool for the first time, hearing them ask questions about repairs and techniques, it brought a sense of purpose I had almost forgotten. People in town noticed. They came by to watch. They said things I will never forget. They said Dad would have smiled if he were alive to see it. Those words, spoken with genuine warmth and respect, felt more comforting than anything I could have imagined. It was as if their recognition, combined with Dad's own words, stitched a piece of my heart back together that had been broken long ago. As for Luke and Tanya, their presence changed as quietly as the wind shifts in autumn. They did not apologize. They did not acknowledge the lies they had spread or the years they had spent trying to erase me. They avoided looking directly at me in public, though they no longer whispered behind my back. Their behavior softened in subtle ways. They stopped spreading stories. They stopped pretending I was invisible, though they never came close to admitting their guilt out loud. Maybe they finally understood, deep down, that their greed had blinded them for far too long. Maybe they finally recognized that family isn't a collection of convenience, that you cannot erase someone's presence simply because it suits your plan. Perhaps the weight of what they had done pressed on them quietly, invisibly, like a shadow they could never fully shake. I didn't hate them. I didn't hold grudges because holding onto that anger would have been like drinking poison slowly. I simply observed and allowed the truth to exist as it was, letting their silence and awkwardness be the only acknowledgement of what had happened. That in itself was justice. Through this experience, I learned a truth that is both bitter and powerful. The people who are supposed to stand with you, support you, protect you, love you unconditionally. Sometimes they are the ones who push you away for their own gain. And it is not always obvious until the years have passed, until the lies have been sown and the erosion of trust has taken root. But even in that betrayal, the truth has a strange, quiet strength. It does not shout. It does not demand attention, yet it waits patiently. And when the moment is right, it rises. It reveals itself. It corrects itself. That is exactly what Dad's will did. It reminded everyone who I truly was. It reminded them of my presence, my loyalty, my care, and my honesty. His words did more than instruct. They defended, they illuminated, they restored. They restored my place in the family, in the community, and in the life I had built silently and consistently over decades. They reminded me of the man I had always been, not the version my siblings tried to erase. And so, if there is one thing I hope anyone listening takes from this story, it is this: never let the lies of others define you. Never allow someone else to write the narrative of your life for their convenience. Stand steady, stay honest, be consistent. Do the right thing even when it seems invisible, even when no one acknowledges it, because the truth has a way of finding its voice. Sometimes it emerges quietly, sometimes it waits years, sometimes it catches you by surprise. But when it rises, it speaks louder than any lie, any manipulation, any scheme ever could. It restores what was lost. It honors the people who mattered. It protects the integrity of your life. And in the end, it delivers a justice so profound that no amount of greed, betrayal, or deceit can ever erase it. Dad's final message to me, his will, and the truth he left behind proved this in the most powerful way. I carry that lesson with me now every day. The workshop hums with life again. The town whispers truth instead of lies, and I can finally feel the weight of betrayal lift just enough to breathe. Justice arrived, not with noise, not with anger, not with revenge, but with quiet, undeniable, absolute truth. And it will always be louder than any lie.